Nope, just me, bitch.
Yo, yo, yo. Just getting set up here. If you only knew how unoriginal you were.
Doing a video.
Yeah, Forrest is a boss.
The channel The Line.
I cooked him in this video.
Particular video is Forrest Balkai and Xena. They're presumably materialists, and they're going to be debating a caller who is an idealist. I am also an idealist, which means that I think reality is fundamentally mental, naturally mental. Another way of saying that is reality is reducible to universal transpersonal mental states. And the video is titled Beware Critical Levels of Woo Nonsense Ahead.
Let's start with Lamont,
right
because we got a couple of God calls here. So let's start with Lamont calling in from Wobbly Axolotls, who just says that God exists. Let's talk about it. Lamont, you're on the line with Forrest and Zena. How are you doing today?
How are you guys doing?
I'm doing really well. Thanks so much for calling in. So before we get started, really quick, what God are we talking about?
What do you mean by that?
Like which God? Is it the God of the Bible? Is it the God of Islam? Is it, the Gigi Manitou? Is it, Native American gods? Is it Zeus? Is it Thor? Is it Poseidon? Like who are we talking about?
I believe all of those entities have fundamental similarities and only superficial differences. So I guess I would classify myself as a mystic.
Okay. So do you believe in one God or lots of them?
I believe in one God. Lots
Okay,
of
so you're a
different interpretations.
monotheist.
So
I don't know that I would call a mystic a monotheist. The color goes on to describe. Now, granted, with the information that Forrest has so far, maybe that's fair. But I certainly would not call myself a monotheist, and I might describe myself as a mystic sometimes.
Would you say that there is any particular interpretation of God that is the most accurate,
no.
or no? Okay, great.
But I mean, I'm an idealist, but I think we can start from there. That it's reasonable to say that consciousness is fundamental, and out of consciousness arise things like perspectives. So first, you like primary substrate of awareness, out of which comes.
Xena just over here munching on some berries or something. She's cool though. She ends up understanding this conversation, I think, a lot more thoroughly than our boy over here.
Ideas and concepts. But all those ideas and concepts are transient, and after we die, we just go back to that fundamental subjectivity that God is.
So what the caller is saying right here, sorry for interrupting, is that everything is consciousness, right? Reality is one field of subjectivity, if you will, and what we call physical stuff is how those subjective experiences appear to apparently independent observers. And he's saying that after death, you go back to being pure subjectivity rather than a localized instantiation of that subjectivity, or particular. You go back from being a particular into a universal. So like one way to imagine this is just imagine a sort of universal, like an infinite body of water. Call it an ocean of consciousness. Within that ocean, there are whirlpools and there are ripples. The whirlpools are individualized, localized points of view, and the ripples are what we call physical stuff. But all of it is ultimately just water. So a whirlpool, a life, an organism, a person, is ultimately just a temporary process of what is actually a universal subjectivity. So after death, the whirlpool is flattening out. Death is the flattening of the whirlpool. So like you were never not water, you only think that you're not water. And death is the realization of oneness, like the ultimate metaphysical realization of oneness.
Cool. So like the Force.
I wouldn't say force, because when you're saying force, you're talking about like energy, maybe, and that either has to be like kinetic
I was
or
saying. No, I was saying like the Force, like from Star Wars, where like when you die, you just go back to this kind of thing that's all encompassing and flows through everybody and stuff.
I don't know that the Force would be thought of as conscious or omnibenevolent, though. I may be wrong. I'm a little bit rusty on my George Lucas.
Okay, well, so you are saying that this God is omnibenevolent.
Oh, sure.
Okay, and just a couple more questions, really quick, just to make sure I know what we're talking about. Is this God also omnipotent?
Yes.
Okay. And then one more, actually two more, sorry. Is it also omniscient? Is it all-knowing? Is it all three omnis?
I might need your help with this one, because as far as omniscient goes, I would say that all knowledge is either latent or expressed from within this entity. So in that, it's omniscient, yeah.
Okay, we'll put a question mark next to that one. And then last but not least, does this God have the ability to think, to make decisions, and to take actions on its own accord?
In order to do that, this God would have to localize and become like you or your host or me. So in order to think, you need a mind which is correlated with.
Yeah, I just want to say real quick that as an idealist, I'm not super fond of omni properties or even the God language. I think that it adds unnecessary, unparsimonious baggage that then is going to require justification or defense. By the way, if you are still here and you are enjoying this content, please show me some love for the algorithm. I have a larger following on TikTok, but I'm having some issues with that account right now. So I'd really appreciate it if you could give me a thumbs up, hit the bell, hit the subscribe, help me get this channel rolling. But yeah, omni properties I think can be indefensible depending on how you cash them out.
Brains, and that's a weakness. So God would have no need for thinking because he's omniscient. He would already know all things. So in order to think, he'd have to like localize, just like you'd have to localize within a dream in order to fly, for instance.
So non-thinking, what about the other two, about being able to take actions and influence physical reality of its own free will?
No, I don't believe that God is an agent because agency would frustrate omniscience.
Look, it seems like it'd be a lot simpler to just say, look, you are the universe becoming aware of itself. The universe itself is just pure awareness, right? It's not self-awareness. It's not metacognition. It's not thinking. It does not have desires. But that universal substrate is the capacity by which you are a mind. And you, us, sentient beings, are the modality by which that complexity allows for self-reflexive consciousness. Rather than ascribing omni properties to the substrate, I don't think we need to do all that. It's ultimately just simple. It is just simple awareness, and that's it. We don't need to say anything else.
Got it. Okay, so just to be clear, I've got a monotheistic God based on idealism. All religions are kind of true. This God is omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and maybe, based on the way you squint your eyes, maybe omniscient. It is non-thinking, non-acting, and is not an agent. I got that about summed up?
I think so.
Okay, groovy. All right, we'll go right ahead. Zena, do you want to kick us off?
Sure, I can start. Well, first of all, when I, asked you this question first, this is kind of like one of the
If y'all stick around, I really start cooking here in a few minutes. Stick around.
interesting topics and questions I have when it comes to God. I just think to start, it's more so just like when we say that this God is the God that exists, I think that like as we started, what's most important is defining God. And it seems to me that we're kind of defining God as like almost like the collective conscious in some way. There are many different ways to describe this. And I think we see different interpretations in different ways, but you kind of define God as some collective conscious. Do you think that's like kind of a word that maybe, or phrase that maps on to this concept of God that you have?
Yeah, I would say rather than a collective conscious, I would say universal consciousness is probably an adequate descriptor of what the caller is trying to get at there.
Sure, yeah, I think that's fair. Like it's just God is the fundamental thing out of which everything else temporarily, everything else is a temporary excitation out of this fundamental thing that's God.
You can think of this in terms of a field as well. Like, for example, when we talk about quantum fields, particles are ultimately just excitation in those fields. So if instead you imagine a non-physical field, if that's possible to imagine, that is not spatially, temporally bound by anything, the reality that we experience are waves in that universal field of subjectivity, of consciousness.
Like a field.
Right, yeah. And
Quantum field.
yeah. And I think when we talk about God in this way, I think it's interesting. And this is why I call myself agnostic, because there's so many different interpretations of what God is. Like, for example, when we look at Spinoza like says things that are somewhat similar to what you're saying, and that he defines things. Some things are like forms, some things are substances. But innately, we kind of all are dependent and contingent upon each other and come from something like similar. Like, for example, at the start of the universe, if we look at things even just like from like a metaphysical level.
Yeah, and by the way, Spinoza was largely considered like an atheist because he doesn't think that this God, Spinoza's God, is not a personal God. It doesn't have like desires for me specifically, and I think I would agree with that line of thinking.
Began, and from that point in which the universe started to expand, we all came from that. So in essence, we all did come from something similar. And then when we go to consciousness, I think that's where it gets a little bit interesting. I guess I have a couple questions. In one, how you define consciousness, and two, I think that even if this God does exist, I think it is important to make a distinction kind of between the way in which people kind of feel about or talk about like a Christian or a Muslim God versus a God sort of like this. But I guess, can I get your definition of consciousness?
Yeah, I borrow the definition of consciousness from David Chalmers, who coined the hard problem of consciousness. And he says that consciousness is what it is like to be.
So an organism is conscious if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism. That just means that it has internal subjective experiences. There is presumably like nothing it is like to be this headphones case, but there's presumably something it is like to be this brain. This terminology, this definition goes all the way back to Thomas Nagel. In 1974, he wrote a paper called "What Is It Like to Be a Bat?" That's where this comes from.
So presumably, it isn't like anything to be a book. Therefore, a book isn't conscious. But it is like something to be you. It is like something to be, and similarly, it is like something to be God. It's a mode of being. So it's not a property of anything. It's a way of being, or it's a mode of being.
Really quick, Lamont, do you have us on Bluetooth or headphones or anything like that?
No, just on my phone.
Okay, cool. There's just a couple of interferences and some sounds. I was seeing if we could fix it. If we can, it's no big deal. Okay, so we can go on with what you're talking about.
Yeah, no, that's
Yeah.
it. I borrowed the same definition from David Chalmers. I try to avoid neologisms.
That's fine.
So I guess just one more question is, when you say we all go back to this consciousness, because I agree that we are having some experience. I don't know. I think some questions we also have is like, is consciousness a thing? Does it really exist, and that is it material?
That's a really interesting way of saying that. Is consciousness a thing? Does it really exist in that it is material? The implication in that, what Zena just said, is that if it's not material, it doesn't exist. I wouldn't agree, like, at all. I don't think this makes any sense whatsoever.
Etc. And
It's just kind of begging the question on a materialist view, right? Because the materialist is going to say that if it is not material, if it cannot be quantified, if it does not have spatial or temporal extension, then it doesn't exist. It's not real. It's conceptual, or it's this or that or whatever. And I just wouldn't agree with that. It's just begging the
when you
question.
say that we go back to consciousness, what does that look like for you, and how are we able to tell that that is the case?
I would say that when you die, the object of experience melts away. I don't know this for sure, so I like to start by just saying, like, look, I don't know. And I think that's really important to start with that. But I think that's one of the main goals of brain, is to separate this from that, here from there, agent versus arena. And we can even see, like, with experiments done with high-dose psychedelic drugs, when you're in a high-dose psychedelic state, the default mode network shuts down, the task-centric network shuts down. People experience what they call ego death, where it is like the agent arena distinction kind of collapses, and you go into this mode, which is kind of like pure subjectivity. And this brain state on high-dose psychedelics is like the closest we can come to being brain dead in a safe and repeatable way. And yet,
Yeah, so the caller is trying to explain that you can experience pure subjectivity, the lack of an object of experience, the lack of an identity, the ego death, by reducing brain activity, right? And this is the case with psychedelics. This is the case with meditation, contemplative practices, certain breathing techniques, etc. Now, I don't think that this is a good place to bring this up, or it's a good line of argument against some materialist position. I think that it can be used in a way that is strategic to say other things, but maybe we'll get into that a little bit later.
this is the most exciting experience that people can have in their lives sometimes.
Yeah. So I suppose going back to this consciousness, like
It's like he's trying to use it to support the proposition that after we die, we go back to being pure subjectivity. And he's saying, like, look, when your brain activity severely reduces, you can directly experience this pure subjectivity. And so that's supposed to be an indication that when brain activity ceases entirely, you just are that pure subjectivity. Again, I don't think this is a super strong argument. I would not make this argument myself.
I know no one really knows what happens when we die, but I suppose if we don't, were you saying that you don't necessarily know if we go back to this consciousness? Like you aren't actually sure if that's the case, or are you speculating? Or
Well, I mean, I guess I think it would be my best guess. I think it would be the most skeptical thing to say, because consciousness cannot be doubted because it's the prerequisite for doubt, and it cannot be an illusion because it's a prerequisite for illusion. You can't have an illusion without being conscious. You can't doubt without being conscious. And so I think that it's a safe bet to prioritize it over the things that are emergent from it. So, I mean, even though I don't know, I mean, it might be the case that when we die, consciousness dies too. But from my perspective, consciousness never developed. It never grows. It's always been the same. My mind has grown. My thoughts have developed. I've become more mature. But consciousness seems to just have this thing where it stays the same. It's just running in the background. And I have no reason to believe that when my biology dies, that consciousness will.
What do you have in common right now with the you that was 5 years old? Most people will probably say, like, nothing. But there's one thing. There's one thing that you right now has in common with you when you were 5 years old, which is that there's an awareness that has been constant, right? Now, the contents of that awareness, the thoughts, the personality, the identity, all those contents fluctuate. They're in constant flux. It's always changing. They interact with each other. New beliefs form, old beliefs disappear, etc. So all that is subject to constant change, but the subject itself, the awareness itself, the being itself has not changed ever. It has not developed. It is constant. There was something it was like to be you at 5 years old. There's something it's like to be you now. So it seems like what the caller is trying to do here is construct an epistemic foundation, the foundation by which we know things, by which we make truth claims. And he's saying, look, the one thing that I cannot doubt is consciousness, is awareness, because it is the thing that doubts. It is the thing that questions. But he's not making a super strong connect. I think what he's wanting to do is try to make this point of parsimony. In that it's more parsimonious to assume that reality itself is mental rather than creating a new category and bringing more issues and doing a bunch of storytelling. He's trying to say, look, I'm staying close to home. I'm staying to what I know. And to assume that consciousness goes away after death, or whatever he's trying to say, is an assumption. And he's trying to say that it's an assumption that's not necessarily justified.
That would just be a leap.
I think I suppose my
questions whenever you're ready.
Yeah, go ahead. Actually, go ahead.
Okay, it's fine. I didn't want to derail you. I'm just telling you. Oh my God, that's a wild thing to say. I would start by
Well,
asking
so-
about just the... Sorry?
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I apologize. Go ahead.
You're fine. So I want to start with the last thing you said, and then I want to work my way backwards. Can you please give me any example that we can actually test and observe and of consciousness existing absent matter?
So look, this question is a loaded question, and it's fallacious for that reason, right? The loaded question fallacy. And here's why. What you're asking for is an observable example of something that is not observable by definition. Subjective experience is not objectively observable by definition. There could be no examples provided of that. It's just a bad question. What it has packed into it is the assumption that consciousness is physical, right? It's just some physical process in your brain. Now, if you assume that, then yeah, brain activity is observable, and consciousness is kind of an illusion or doesn't exist or it's epiphenomenal or whatever, right? But this is not an internal critique of the caller's worldview, right? What Forrest is doing is literally just begging the question on his own view by asking this question. It's very subtle, it's multi-layered, but hopefully my viewers can understand what I'm saying with this.
Well, I can't give you an example of consciousness existing because of matter. I mean, because of my material body, you can have signs of consciousness.
Yeah, so what the caller is saying there is that consciousness has never been found inside brains. Brains have only ever been found inside consciousness. This is not a metaphysical claim, this is an epistemic claim. First, you are aware of the world. You then make observations of the world, and some of those observations you find brain. Those brains you associate with people. Those people you assume are conscious. You assume that, right? But at no point in time are you ever directly observing some mental state.
So you have evidence that consciousness emerges from brain states? There's a Nobel Prize waiting for you if that's the case.
No, that's pretty much like, granted, the hard problem of consciousness about what it really is and blah, 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 blah. Like, sure, we don't know exactly what it is.
It's not about what it is. It's not about what it really is. So the hard problem of consciousness, right? David Chalmers wrote about this in 1995. I think it was called Facing Up to the Problem of Consciousness. In this paper, he delineated the hard problem and the easy problems. So sometimes I like to use this example. So if you poke my brain and my leg moves, right? There's a behavior that occurs as a result of you poking my brain. There's nothing really that strange about that, right? We can trace that with electrical activity, neuronal firing, impulses, etc. But if you poke my brain, my leg moves, and I'm there to witness it, experience it, observe that movement from the inside, there is something weird about that. So the leg moving is the easy problem. The presence of an internal observer is the hard problem, is seemingly unexplainable in physical terms, right? So the hard problem is not about like what is consciousness. The hard problem is that if we assume that consciousness is the result of some physical process, right, or that it's emergent from the physical, a magical, logical leap would be required, going from third-person objective descriptions to first-person subjective experience, right? There is no logical connection. There's no deduction that can be drawn. There's no derivation you can give me where third-person objective physical processes give rise to subjectivity. This is an a priori conceptual issue being pointed out with the view. It's not something that should be dismissed, and then you go to the empirical evidence. The empirical evidence, the posteriori, cannot cure the a priori issues with the view.
But I think it's overwhelmingly evident that it is at least dependent on matter to exist. It is an emergent property.
two different things he just said there. It's dependent on matter to exist, and it's an emergent property. Nobody is arguing against dependence, right? So, but dependence is not ontological identity, and correlation is not causation. Everybody acknowledges that there are these correlations between what we call matter and what we call mental states. Nobody denies that. But to take that data and then conclude that it is an emergent property is not a scientific claim. This is a philosophical interpretation of the data that I think is ultimately false. Maybe we can get into that later.
And we can look back to like the earliest understandings of neuroscience and psychology and really, I guess neuropsychology is this thing, but like just we can look back to the earliest examples of this, all back to like Phineas Gage type shit, and know that the structure of your brain determines quite a bit about how your consciousness is expressed, if indeed it exists at all.
Yeah, nobody disagrees with that. So Phineas Gage is an example that is often brought up in online communities, but it's not an example that holds a lot of academic philosophical weight. This is called the argument from brain damage. So Phineas Gage, I don't remember his exact story, to be honest with you, but it had something to do with him having a spike driven through his brain, right? And it completely changed his personality. And so again, this is evidence of correlation, not evidence of causation, right? If I drive a spike through a radio, okay, it's going to change the way the music plays through my speakers. But if I then concluded that a sufficient explanation of music, right, is that it emerges from radios and there's no further explanation needed, I would be wrong. So it's not that I think that the brain is a radio, just to be clear. I don't. I think that's ultimately false as well. But the purpose of that analogy is to demonstrate that the conclusion you are drawing from this body of evidence does not follow. It's not necessarily the case, right? And if it's not necessarily the case that your emergent property explanation is true, if it doesn't necessarily follow from this data that therefore consciousness is an emergent property of physical activity, you have to provide extra argumentation, and it's going to have to be a priori, right? It's not going to be in the category of empirical evidence, because any evidence like this that you want to bring up is, yes, it would be consistent if it was an emergent property, right? It would be consistent with that view, but it also happens to be consistent with like every other view in the philosophy of mind: dualism, panpsychism, idealism, right? The radio analogy would be like a form of dualism, but you could be an idealist. You could say, look, everything in reality is just made up of consciousness, right? It just manifests as matter. Matter is a mode of what is ultimately, fundamentally, consciousness. Everything is universal consciousness. And so humans and brains are made up of that consciousness. And so when that consciousness organizes in a complicated enough way, you get a human mind and a human brain. That's what it looks like from the outside. To me, it looks like consciousness. To you, from the outside, it looks like a brain. So it would follow that if you drive a spike through my brain, right, it's going to alter my mind, because my brain just is my mind, even under an idealist. But I'm not saying that the matter is generating the mind. So it's the inverse, right? The matter would be, in a sense, an emergent property of the mental, not the other way around. That evidence would be perfectly consistent with that view. So it's not an argument for physicalism. You're just saying, like, look, physicalism is logically consistent with the empirical data. Like, okay, but that's not an argument for the view.
If that wasn't the case, then we wouldn't be able to dramatically alter somebody's entire consciousness, not just their, basic parts of their personality, but what they're aware of, what the information they are able to process about the world around them, how, if at all, they are able to make decisions. Like, all sorts of things beyond just their personality, but also critically including their personality simply by altering parts of their nervous system, mainly their brain. So, like, when I look across the animal kingdom, I look at all sorts of things that have different levels of consciousness and different kinds of consciousness. All of those things have one thing in common, is that they are made of matter. And I have yet to see any example of any kind of consciousness at all that exists independent of matter.
Yeah, it seems like he has dualism built into the way that he's trying to critique this other person, the caller's view. I mean, look, even if it was the case that the caller was arguing for dualism, you wouldn't be able to see the thing that you're referring to anyway, so it wouldn't be an adequate internal critique of the view. Like, if you're just saying that, look, the only things that matter to me are empirical evidence. If you don't have any empirical evidence, then, I reject the view. Okay, fine. But when you're doing an internal critique, right, you're supposed to wear the view like a glove and then see what falls out of that. I mean, that's like the most efficacious way to do a genuine, an honest internal critique. So it seems like Forrest is arguing against dualism of some sort, but the caller is an idealist. So matter is not separate from consciousness. He's not trying to say that consciousness is separate from matter. Matter is the expression of consciousness. It's similar to like a neutral monist view, right? Where a neutral monist would say that, like, look, there is this one substance of reality, and it expresses itself in physical ways, and it expresses itself in mental ways. But it's really just two different modes of presentation of the same underlying substance. An idealist is saying something very similar, but the idealist is saying
Thank you.
that one underlying substance, that's not really a substance, is mental. It's consciousness. Anyway.
So you might say that I have not done whatever prerequisite test to say conclusively that brains produce consciousness. And I would scoff at that, but like at the end of the day, sure, that can be our hang up. But I can still show you that brains are directly responsible and a major part of the expression of consciousness.
So here's the thing, if you completely ignore the a priori issue that Chalmers pointed out in 1995, you're not going to see the problem at all, right? There's a cumulative case that can be built, right? There's no good reason to suspect that this magical logical leap from the third person objective processes to the first person like properties of experience actually happen. There's no good reason to think that the reality out there is fully capturable in third person objective language. What I mean by that is there's no good reason to think, other than you just assume it to be the case, that reality itself is non-mental, right? This is not something that's shown by science. This is a metaphysical conclusion that Forrest makes, which is not scientific, right? It's a belief. It's a faith position. To say that the world out there is fully capturable in quantitative terms, or that the only things that exist are the things that which can be observed by like us evolved monkeys, it's a stance. It's a belief. But anyway, I'm just ranting now about my boy Forrest. Love you, Forrest. If you want to have a debate, hit me up.
And you've got nothing in terms of consciousness exists absence of all of this. So like, that's what I'm asking. Can you give me anything to point to say that consciousness is not the direct result of matter?
I did with the 2012 study.
If I was the caller, I would be hammering down on the hard problem. Or I would be hammering down on the idea that the hard problem, the a priori conceptual issue, the logical issues with the view are not cured by anything empirical you want to say. It's simply just not how it works, right? It's just not how it works. You have to cure this logical issue before we can even talk about the empirics. We can't even get off the ground with your view because I don't even think it's plausible to begin with because of this logical issue.
I don't know if you guys partake.
I'm sorry,
but,
would you please? I'm sorry, you were breaking up at the beginning. Please repeat.
I can talk about. Oh, sorry about that. I said, yeah, I'm somebody who partakes. You know what I mean? I'm a big fan of Terence McKenna. So the high-dose psychedelic studies, which is what I brought up before, this is the closest that the brain can get to being brain dead in a safe and repeatable way. And yet, even though the brain metabolism is slowing to a crawl in those instances, this is the most deep and meaningful and colorful environment.
In other words, do not give in to their scientism. Do not give in, do not concede the conceptual ground, the philosophical ground. Many of these debates are centered in the empirical category, in the posteriori category, because that's how we've developed to think here in the West, because the scientific method has been so successful in a very particular domain, which is like the creation of technology, whether it be medical technology, etc., right? Do not let them drive
Look, I
that
need everybody who's
conversation.
watching right now.
Oops.
But I mean, that's kind of just where my thoughts are lying. And
So I'm going to say,
Sorry,
number
folks.
one, consciousness.
Twitch away from matter. Is showing evidence of at all. I was going to have you repeat it, but I remember exactly how you said it. Matter, and you're giving me this runaround, asking you specifically. Well, I'd
Sorry,
love to
folks.
see that study, but
Bear with
so
me.
far,
I don't know
no,
what
that
happened.
is my way. And if you have a study that says on plenty of psychedelics in my life, it's not exactly the most exciting part of a person's life.
Without light.
So you are missing the point of what I'm saying. So let me use your examples to restate what I'm saying. When brain activity slows to a crawl, we call that a coma. And that's not exactly the most exciting part of a person's life. You are describing an altered mental state brought by psychedelics. And yes, I have also done plenty of psychedelics in my life, and I have felt some altered brain states. It did not tell me anything new about the existence of consciousness, that it exists outside.
I'm doubtful that you've done psychedelics.
In any way. And if you have a study that says this person did X amount of acid and now we have a reason that consciousness is ethereal and not related to matter at all, I'd love to see that study. But so far, no, that is, I didn't say you did. I didn't say you did. But that is what I'm asking for. I didn't say you did say those things. I am asking you specifically if you have any reason, any serious evidence of consciousness existing outside of, independent of matter. And you're giving me this runaround about psychedelics and stuff. And now you're also talking about this idea that we get, what was the last thing you said? Repeat it for, about the
I agree with Forrest here. It's not clear what the caller is trying to point out. I know where I would go with the psychedelic conversation. I mean, look, what we know from science, and this is constantly changing, so this might already be outdated, but at one time, what we knew from science was that when someone is under the influence of psychedelics, like psilocybin, for example, overall brain metabolism, global metabolic activity goes way down. But local connectivity goes up by 0.005%. Again, that might be outdated, but it's not clear what the caller is trying to point out there.
Sebastian, pardon me. I was going to have you repeat it, but I remember exactly how you said it. You said that I'm saying that fire exists on its own, or fire is evidence of combustion, as opposed to, that's not at all what I'm saying. I am pointing to the fact that if you put hydrocarbons and oxygen together with heat, you then produce carbon dioxide and water. That is the chemical formula of combustion. Fire is the physical manifestation of that formula that you can see with your mind, or with your eyes. That is something that you can witness now, that chemical reaction taking place. So I'm not saying that the fire is showing evidence of, like, none of that. I am literally looking for the constituent parts here. And the constituent parts of consciousness is some kind of matter. I would argue it's neurons, but if you want to say something other than brains, I'm not going to get into nitpicky. It is matter. It's something that is made of atoms and takes up space and has mass. So do you have evidence, again, of any consciousness whatsoever that is verifiably independent of material, of matter?
This whole conversation is just like, look, I have empirical evidence that is consistent with physicalism. do you have empirical evidence that would demonstrably show that physicalism is false? Which is like not interesting, because it's a category error. The evidence is also consistent with idealism, with panpsychism. I mean, I probably repeated myself 10 times. I don't even think this question can be decided by the empirics, because of the non-observable nature of first-person conscious experiences. It's not something that you can demonstrate, right? It's just like repeatedly begging the question on behalf of Forrest. He's not really providing an adequate argument to favor physicalism over, say, idealism, with the empirical evidence specifically. Now, granted, the caller is not doing an excellent job of delineating what I'm delineating right now. If he were, I think this conversation may have gone a bit differently. Let's continue.
Okay, when we're talking about reduction bases in metaphysics, the world looks just as it should if materialism were true. The world also looks just as it should if idealism is true. The world looks just as it should if constitutive panpsychism is true.
Good job. I spoke too soon. That is his way of delineating that the evidence you're talking about is consistent with all these views.
Physicists don't care about metaphysics. What I'm saying is I'm starting with a different assumption. And I'm wondering, because what you're saying is, I'm saying consciousness is fundamental. And now that's a guess, right? And I'll admit that to you. It may be true that there are some particles or some, I don't know, fairies, pixie dust, whatever it is that you might assume is floating outside of consciousness. But I'm saying consciousness is all we have. It's the thing that we know for sure exists. If you think something exists outside of awareness that gives rise to awareness itself, that is by definition completely blocked from any shred of evidence, even in principle. So if you believe
which means
in
that, you're one twitch away from the hard solipsism issue, and saying if consciousness is all you know to exist, your consciousness is all you know to exist. You're now in the same issue of saying I don't know that anything exists besides my brain, besides my mind. It gets you nowhere.
I don't think so.
Yeah, that's not true, right? This is a slippery slope fallacy being committed by Forrest here. Look, I think it's pretty hard to deny that the one thing you know with the most certainty is that you are conscious, right? Everything outside of that is questionable. I just think that this is a proper epistemic foundation. It's not even necessarily a metaphysical claim. It is the foundation from which you can build a worldview. And so what the caller is saying is that from within experience, assuming that there is something out there which is non-experiential, can never be verified. It's an unfalsifiable assumption. And it's a postulation that's not necessary to explain the world. Now, this is often conflated with solipsism, but it is not solipsism for the simple reason that I assume that you are conscious as well. I assume that other minds exist. That's it. And I make that assumption inference based on an argument from similarity. Maybe we won't go into that right now, but people always want to say, well, idealism collapses into solipsism. And it's just like, look, dude, you have the problem of solipsism too, because we all start within mind, unless you're somehow starting from outside your mind, or you somehow have a greater certainty of things than I could possibly. You somehow don't have the same limitations as I do epistemically. Like, you have the same problem. So I don't know why people always want to put this, like, just on idealists as if it's their problem to deal with. Like, if you're going to be skeptical, you got to be all the way skeptical. You're not allowed to make any inferences. You're not allowed to assume anything else. If you say that only the only thing you can know for sure is that consciousness exists, you have to stay right there. No, well, we can infer our way out of there. Like, no. We can be reasonably certain that other minds exist. It can be a reasonable assumption or inference.
Meanwhile, you're saying...
Plus, solipsism doesn't have any explanatory power. It doesn't explain anything. It just says, like, Look, you're all figments of my imagination. Okay, that's a statement. That's not an explanation. Idealism has explanatory power. So parsimony is not the only virtue when we consider these philosophical worldviews, right? There are like 5 virtues in total. At least 5.
Okay, solve the problem of hard solipsism then.
Yeah, I think it's easy. So the materialist wants us to believe in 4 things. Number 1, that you are conscious. Number 2, that others are conscious. Number 3, that there is something outside of consciousness. And number 4, that that thing gives rise to consciousness itself. So the idealist takes the first 2 and just rejects the second 2 based on skepticism. So I'm going to say, number 1, consciousness does exist because I can't doubt it and it can't be illusion. Number 2, other people's consciousness exists, and I think even though I can't prove that your consciousness exists, I can believe that it's reasonable based on evidence. If you touch a hot stove, you're going to respond in general the same way that I do. So
you just
that doesn't
described
defeat
an assertion.
solipsism, as you know. Every
That doesn't
philosopher
defeat
knows hard
solipsism at all.
solipsism can't be defeated.
Yes,
But
I think-
which is what I just which is what I just said to you, and then you said you could easily defeat it, and then you just described faith. You haven't done anything that you claim to be able to do, and I.
Faith is belief. Faith is belief without reason. The caller described that he had reasons for the belief that other minds exist. That's not faith. But this is kind of like gonna devolve from here. Forrest is gonna start crashing out here in a
haven't even
minute.
gotten into the actual serious questions about your God yet. I'm just trying.
Now, I do think the caller did a good job delineating the sort of the materialist wants you to believe these 4 things. The idealist only has to believe these 2 things. So what he's trying to demonstrate there is parsimony. The idealist has less assertions than the materialist. And what Forrest is trying to say is like, look, if you're not going to take the other 2, then you have to be a solipsist. And this is just obviously not true, right? It's not true. Solipsism is not entailed by idealism. It's just internet garbage.
I think in order to
understand
you think in order to set
how
up a defeater, you have to have a proof?
I'm just trying to understand if you're saying that the whole universe looks as exactly as it should if there's materialism and idealism. Okay, on this planet right now, it looks exactly as it should if the sun orbited the Earth. It would look this exact way. How can we actually then verify whether the sun orbits the Earth or the Earth orbits the sun? We can.
You don't verify metaphysics. It's a category error. You don't prove your metaphysics empirically. Now, one virtue by which you can evaluate a metaphysics, like physicalism, like idealism, is empirical adequacy. So if there's something about the empirics that says, yeah, the depending on how you define physical, the universe is, not physical, not that. The empirics can do that, or it's not mental. But I don't even know what that would like look like necessarily. Maybe some weird like quantum experiment. But generally, looking for metaphysical confirmation via the empirics is a pipe dream. It's a category error. Simple as that. There is no empirical verification that the world is mind independent, that the world as we observe it is mind independent. That's not even possible in principle.
Actually do some tests and figure that out. You are now telling me that at the end of the day, you just have to make an assumption, and that isn't reasonable to me.
No,
Has something to say.
not at all. No, you've misheard me. The universe looks just as it should if there's a teapot orbiting Saturn. I'm asking for evidence that there is such a teapot. You and I both believe and agree that there is awareness.
I have provided you evidence. I have provided evidence. I have provided evidence. I'm going to just put you on mute for a second because you need to hear me. I have provided evidence, and just so many better scientists than I will ever be. I provided just more evidence than we can possibly imagine that consciousness is at least seriously associated with matter. I am asking you for any evidence whatsoever that consciousness can exist absent of matter, and we've gotten nowhere. Xena, you had something that you wanted to say before.
Yeah, again, the idealist is not saying that consciousness exists absent of matter. Matter is an expression of consciousness. Matter is how consciousness appears when viewed from different perspectives. Again, I think he's just arguing against dualism and doesn't really have a good fundamental understanding of what idealism is even trying to say.
I bring the walnut back.
Yeah, for sure. And I think also the biggest fundamental issue we're kind of like running into is like, what does exist truly mean? Like in that, like what do you mean when you say that consciousness exists? Like, what are we kind of positing to be that case? I think many materialists will take that like existence means that something is actually like materially like there, like maybe it's made.
But by the way, if you guys are still watching, I would really appreciate if you go over to the red app, this one that I'm not allowed to talk about, find this page, right, and this other page, and hit that button. That would really help me out a whole bunch.
Made up of matter or something of the sort. I guess like when we talk about consciousness, I suppose the real question is like, what do you mean when you say that consciousness exists, or like that thoughts, or like maybe like a thought exists or an idea exists in general? I think that's like the biggest issue here. And I think when we kind of just like look at like science and biology, or pretty much any just like structured kind of inquiry, is we're always looking at associations to determine like cause and effect. And even in philosophy, we have like the PSR, etc., and these ideas that like, you know, such things have effects. And when we look at things being associated with each other multiple times over and over and over again, we come to some conclusion that it's one thing causes the other thing, etc. So when we look at, I think like what we're trying to see here, of course, is like what we're trying to say here is that we're seeing associations with the brain and matter produce a conscious experience. Like it seems to be the case that the conscious experience is associated with like matter and like the brain, and we don't. And I guess
So look, I like the way Xena's approaching this conversation a lot better. I think she's more inquisitive. I think she has a better intuitive understanding of what maybe the caller is trying to communicate. I think that she has a little more good faith, maybe. But that being said, right? Like again, like I think what we observe with neuroscience gives us the neural correlates of consciousness, right? The NCC. And so what we observe is a connection between physical brain states. No, sorry, connection is the wrong word. A correlation between physical brain states and certain reported experiences of human beings, right? And what that tells us is that certain aspects of a human mind is correlated to certain aspects of physical brains, right? What we call physical brains. But what the caller is pointing at is something deeper. When he says that reality is consciousness, he's not talking about that it's human consciousness. He's not saying that reality is a human brain or should look like a human brain. He's not even saying that consciousness is like separate from matter, right? He's talking about awareness, which is something that is far more basic than like a human mind. A human mind is a complex arrangement of awareness that displays as a human brain. So the human mind, yes, is always going to show up as a complex nervous, as a human brain, right? Human eyesight is always going to show up as eyes and the visual cortex, right? Human metacognitive thinking is always going to show up as whatever the prefrontal cortex or whichever cortex it's supposed to be. So if you remove those features of a human brain, you're removing those features of the human mind because they're not separate things. The matter is the extrinsic representation of mind. That applies to the whole body, including the brain. Hopefully that makes sense. And feel free to ask me any questions. If something I say doesn't click for you, feel free to ask.
his question is one, what do you mean when you say consciousness exists? And how can something exist if it's not matter, kind of outside of the brain? I guess it's just like a really big question I have in regards to like your theory of consciousness.
All right, Lamont, we'll bring you back.
Yeah. So to answer you first, and then I will get to her. I don't know either your name. I'll touch that. But you mentioned consciousness being associated with matter. Nobody doubts that consciousness is associated with matter. In integrated information theory and global workspace theory, that's obvious. I'm not saying that there isn't a correlation between consciousness and brain states. I'm saying that you're just committing a classic causation correlation fallacy. If you know and can demonstrate to me how consciousness arises from states in the brain, I don't think you can. No neuroscientist can. This is the reason that the hard problem persists. But to move on to the question about existence and what I mean by existence, there are two things that I mean. Exist literally means ex out and sist to stand. So something that exists can be foregrounded. So if you're listening to my voice, you're ignoring background noises, which means you have foregrounded my voice. There's another form of existence, mind-independent existence. And this is what reductionists are looking for, right? So I think that the only thing which stands up to that test of what can exist mind-independently, it would be pure subjectivity. Because what the mind is a subject-object correlation, right? That's what the mind does. It says, I'm here, you're there. I'm this, and I want that. The mind is very correlated with brain states, again. But I think before all of that, there is pure subjectivity, pure awareness before that localization happens.
So you said that I can't demonstrate that, like, there is a correlative thing between a relationship between or sorry,
obvious.
not a correlative, a causal. Pardon me. You said that I can't demonstrate a causal. Right. Pardon me, a causal relationship in the brain and the mind, except I can provide strong.
I didn't say that.
What I heard you say. Here's your chance to correct me. What I heard you say is that I can demonstrate that these things are associated, and nobody doubts that. But I'm how do you say committing a correlation versus causation fallacy. That I'm saying here is a correlation, therefore it must be causal. Post hoc ergo propter hoc, right? But the problem is that I actually can provide evidence for that causal relationship, because if we change the brain, we can equally change the mind in the same measure. And
no, I'm not committing a correlation causation fallacy. I have more than correlation. Okay, cool. What do you have? More correlations that I'm gonna call causation. Look, for anyone who's interested, there's a philosopher and cognitive scientist at UC, who wrote a paper called The Metaphysical Neutrality of Cognitive Science. And the whole point of this paper, it came out like 2 years ago. Whole point of the paper is to point out, right, that the kind of data we collect in cognitive science, and I would argue neuroscience as well, is not the kind of data that could even in principle answer these kinds of questions. Is consciousness physical? Is it non-physical? Is physicalism true? Is panpsychism true? Is dualism true? Is idealism true? The kind of data that we're able to collect in that science is not capable of ever providing a definitive result or demonstrating a causal link between these two things that we know are correlated. These two conceptual things, right? Consciousness, subjective experience, and physical brain states. It's pretty widely accepted that the science does not answer this question. But yet, for some, they kind of don't branch out into philosophy much, and don't really understand this issue to a deep degree.
we can do it predictably and testably. Now, that you may not like those things, but my question to you remains, do you have a single bit of evidentiary, like anything, to demonstrate that you have a similar relationship with non-matter and the same consciousness? Can you manipulate something else that isn't material or demonstrate some non-actual material connection to this brain and show that the mind changes?
You would not be able to physically demonstrate something that is non-physical. Like again, he's just arguing against dualism here, which is like not what the color, but even if it were the case that I was a dualist, right, I would still say that you're making a category error by asking for a physical demonstration of something that's non-physical. Like it doesn't even make sense.
Are you intentionally using mind and consciousness synonymously, or is that an accident? Because if it's not, then it's just modal confusion.
Is that really where we're going to take the argument? Is that what?
No,
which do you prefer?
It pertains to exactly. No, it pertains to exactly what you asked. You said brain
If I
state
have
and
a
mind
light
state,
bulb,
and you said that's obvious,
if
and
I
you're
have
right. It is obvious.
Lamont, if I have a light bulb here, right, and I flip a switch, and electricity goes through the wire, and it turns on the light bulb, right? If I cut the wire, the light bulb turns off. So I can now say that there is some correlation between this wire and this light bulb. Is the wire what's making the light bulb work? No, it's electricity, right? But the wire is definitely in control of this situation. So now we can say, here's the brain, and here's some sort of consciousness, mind, whatever you prefer to say. If I damage,
that's
or
the
alter,
mistake.
or destroy the brain, if I damage or alter or destroy the brain, then the consciousness changes.
That's the mistake.
What's the mistake?
The mistake is correlation causation fallacy, right? If A is correlated to B, let's say A is the physical state, let's say B is the reported subjective experience or the behavior of the individual or the capabilities of the individual, the intellectual capabilities or something like that. If A, the physical state, is correlated to B, the mental state, it is either the case that A causes B, right? B causes A non-temporally, or C causes A and B, right? From that evidence alone, you do not know which one of these is the case, right? To say that A causes B based on just that evidence, right? The dependence, is to make a correlation causation fallacy. There's no way around it. You have to broaden your horizons, brother. The argument from brain damage is outdated, to say the least.
Mistake is you're using mind and consciousness synonymously.
I literally just said whichever one you prefer.
No,
I'm asking you.
Wait. It shows that you're confused though, because the mind is something you have.
I gave it to you. I didn't make a statement. I asked you which you prefer.
Consciousness is something you are.
I don't care.
I think. Are you talking about awareness?
Okay, so show me if you can, like now that you understand.
The argument from brain damage is
can you give me
old news, bro.
Okay, fine. That's okay.
I would love to have whatever conversation.
Crash out.
Okay, fair enough. Let's get rid of the meta. I'm going to ask you a simple question. Now that you know we're not talking about mind and we're talking about awareness.
Never said we weren't.
Can you? That's fine. Don't take it personally. Maybe I misunderstood. I'll put it on me. Here's the question.
Thing to get hung up on.
Can you give
Lost in the forest. I see what you did there.
Between brain states and consciousness. I'm not talking about mind. I'm talking about consciousness, which is pre-mental. Your mind develops. I'm not talking about that. That's something you have. I'm talking about what you are.
He's asking for a causal principle, a bridge law, if you will, that links like physical descriptions of brain activity, such as frequency, um, neuronal firing, ion potential, these kinds of things, linking that physical activity to first-person subjective experience. He's asking for a conceptual connection, a causal conceptual connection between those. Obviously, like Forrest cannot like give that because that's what the hard problem is there is no bridge law. There's no logical inference, right? A valid logical inference from third person to first person. That's not something that's allowed. Like, it's a category error.
Are you
What
talking
I
about,
are.
so I
Sorry,
think,
go
are
ahead.
you referring to just like the brute fact of like awareness, as in like animals have awareness and so do like humans, and when we like change the brain, that awareness can show up differently, like you can have different thoughts and different ideas, but that awareness is still there. Is that the substance you're talking about?
Now you're getting it. You're understanding it. A housefly has awareness. Its mind is less developed and less capable of development than the human mind, because the human mind is correlated with a very powerful brain. So I'm not talking about mind. We agree on that mind and brain are correlated. I'm talking about pure subjectivity, awareness from which mind emerges and develops.
Now, I think, right, so here's where I can try to like give some of my slight biological understanding. So we know that like humans, as they develop, like fetuses, for example, at 24 to 28 weeks, we start to see like connections in the, I'm going to try to say it right, but the hypothalamo-cortical connections start to happen. And that's when we know that something like consciousness begins to arise. Again, biologists are still having
Not
a hard
true.
time with consciousness.
Not
It's a
true.
difficult thing. We do know that, again, matter is greatly associated with like this conscious experience. And I think this is where again, I start to get to this, with this confusion of like what you mean by existing mind independent. Because like I think you gave some sort of you gave something, but it didn't really, I think, point to me of like what something existing really means. Like if we know that like from everything that we've seen thus far, that you need some of these connections and something like a braid, right, to form this experience. Where are you getting this idea that this awareness exists outside of this matter thing we got in our head? You know?
I would say the idea that awareness or consciousness is universal or fundamental is entailed by the failure of the concept of emergence, right? So you could say something like consciousness is either emergent or it's fundamental. There's only two options. It's a true dichotomy. I don't see any third option. If you have some third option, drop it in the comments. So consciousness is either emergent or it's fundamental. If it is not emergent, right, then it's fundamental. So then you have to provide an argument against emergence. And the argument against emergence is going to be something like the brain cannot even, in principle, be a sufficient explanation of consciousness. Therefore, it does not emerge from the brain. It calls for a deeper explanation. And I think that really the only option that's feasible or available to us is that it's fundamental to reality. That is where the idea comes from. That is where the evidence points to. And by evidence, I mean information that raises the probability of that being true, right? The information that raises the probability of the proposition consciousness is universal being true is the hard problem. That is evidence for the claim. The hard problem of consciousness is evidence in favor of the claim consciousness is universal.
No, I think that's kind of where,
Well,
again, I could be misunderstood.
I think, I think another piece of evidence for this is that our brain only gives us a filtered version of consciousness. We have limited access to the light spectrum. Yeah, the first thing you learn in acoustic and articulatory phonetics, which is what I'm studying right now in cognitive science, that the universe is essentially silent. So when a sound wave goes into your ear, the eardrum vibrates, the cochlea translates that vibration into electrical signals. None of that is sound. The universe is actually silent. So what science is telling us is that most of the things that you take for granted, such as the bookshelf behind Forrest, if you look at those books, right, the colors, those are transjective properties. They're not objective. the shape of the books, the texture of the books. All like your brain is making all of that up right now, right? And you're seeing a very low resolution image of reality. So I'm saying, what is mind independent reality like? And I think it is purely subjective because the objective distinction depends on the brain. So when the brain goes,
He's just saying that what we call the physical world is an appearance within consciousness. So I observe the world. Like right now, I'm looking out my window. I see green grass. I see blue skies. Those are relative properties. Those are not the true objective properties of the world. That is the world as I perceive it. You might be interested in like Immanuel Kant, who is a transcendental idealist. He made the famous phenomena noumena distinction. Um, you know, he's saying that there is the thing in itself as it exists for itself in itself, and then there is, and that's the noumena. And then there is the phenomena, which is the thing as perceived by us. So the caller wants to say that, look, there is a reality out there. And when I perceive that reality, it has the appearance of having physical properties. But that appearance is dependent upon who it's appearing to. And so reality is not actually how it appears to me. It is outside of how it appears to me. Right? What it is in itself is not something that I can apprehend with my sense perception. And he's saying the most logical explanation is that what it is in itself is more subjectivity, more consciousness, universal consciousness.
that's all that goes. That's what goes with it. Objectivity.
Right. Like, is that like, so I think we're presuming that, like, though, that, like, this, like, mind independent reality, this gets into loads of different questions, but let's presume that there is some reality that exists outside of our minds, right? Is that what you're calling consciousness?
Yes, that's what I'm calling pure awareness. Yeah.
I think that that's just like, it's almost like using the wrong word, right? I think that, like, consciousness and the way that we know it describes, like, almost like the way in which we kind of self-interrogate. It's again, like, let's call it.
Yeah, she's just defining the word differently, right? So he was specific. He means when he's talking about pure awareness, she's talking about some higher level mental faculty like self-awareness, like self-consciousness, like metacognition, meta-consciousness, whatever you want to call it, awareness of self and surroundings, a more like neurological definition. This frequently happens and we end up always just talking past each other because we're trying to use our own language model to interpret what someone else is trying to say. It's just never going to work. Again, I think Xena's doing a better job than Forrest over here, but yeah. Anyway.
This awareness thing. If we didn't have without a single awareness, there's nothing to be aware. So I think a better way to describe that is just like unfiltered reality. I don't know if the right word to use is consciousness for that. I mean, I guess I think that's just like the biggest thing, right? I think that we're all, again, animals, bugs, insects, anything living is experiencing this outer world that we're presuming exists, right? Differently. But to presume that outer world is then like pure consciousness or something, I think that would then be, to me, the leap. But I can take it to Forrest now or anyone else.
It's not a leap. Starting from first principles, what you know for sure exists is consciousness. And then I assume, right, I know my own consciousness immediately, and then I assume that you are conscious, you are also in mind. And that entails that we exist in a shared reality. So my mind exists, your mind exists. That means that we must exist in some shared reality. The question is, what is the nature of that shared reality? Is it of the same essence of me and you that I've already come to the conclusion on? Or is it of some different essence? The most parsimonious thing to say is that it's of the same essence of me and you. It is subjective in nature, right? Nature is subjective. Nature is consciousness. This shared reality is a mental reality. This is parsimonious. To avoid creating a new category called physical that creates a fatal explanatory issue when it comes to trying to explain the emergence of a human mind, from a non-mental substrate, we don't got to do that. We don't got to back ourselves into a corner. We don't need to create a new category. We don't need to make more assumptions than what is necessary. Because if you assume that whatever exists out there is non-mental in nature, it's essentially non-mental, you just created a problem, an unsolvable problem. Why would you do that? So it's not a leap to say that reality is mental. It's a leap to say that reality is physical if you're working from first principles.
idea.
I just
What is a better candidate? And maybe
I
that's
just want to
that's
throw
for
out
both of
there.
you, and then I'll get off the line.
No, you go ahead
Oh.
first, Ina.
Okay, no worries. I think that when you posit that God definitely exists, I think our
Okay. Alright, we out of here. We out of here. I mean, I'm staying up. I am now accepting guest requests. Let me get rid of this, and this, and this, and this, and bring this back. Let's go. What's up, everybody? What's up? What's up? What's up? Yeah, so look, Ryan, definitions are not objective, right? You can't say the definition of consciousness is objectively, you know, aware of self and surroundings. No, 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 dude. No. No, that's a definition that you can use and is particularly useful in a certain context, like neurology, for example. But in the philosophical context, as you are in right now, that definition is particularly useless. Like, the definition that philosophers use is what it's like to be, right? Coined by Thomas Nagel. Uh, this is not controversial. This is pretty widely agreed upon. X is conscious if and only if there is something it is like to be X. This is pretty universally agreed upon among philosophers. Of course, you're going to have some dissenters, but definitions are not objective; they are subjective. Number one. Number two, they are context dependent on their efficaciousness. Right, so different definitions of the same word are going to be used in different contexts. This is just not very controversial. If you insist on your own definition, you're not capable of having a productive conversation. Oh, Thomas Nagel got bleeped? That's crazy, bro. That's crazy. Skynet out here. Anyway, I am taking opposition now. If anybody would like to oppose or give an argument or motivate physicalism of the mind, feel free to come on up. Go find. Alright, whatever. Let's see. Make sure we're still streaming on YouTube. Okay, looking good. How's everybody doing today? Yeah, where is Sky Daddy? Come back, Sky Daddy. Hey, thanks for the follow. We got 6 followers. I don't remember all of your names, but I appreciate that. Thank you so much. If I could get anybody who enjoyed that video that I was playing, if you could go over to the Red app. I really need subscribers on this account and this account, right? So if you go over to the Red app, right, and you just search this account and this account, and hit that button on both those accounts, I would very much appreciate that. I don't get paid for any of this, guys. I just do this for y'all. I do it for the likes, bro. I do it for the engagement. I do it for the conversation. I do it for epistemic justice. I do it for, I don't know. I do it for the love of the game. Yeah, that's right, Scott. Hey, thanks for the follow, JC. I do it for the truth. Yeah. Yeah, Sky Daddy's all of a sudden missing in action. What happened, bro? What happened? Oh, I gotta message somebody. Is this fundamental awareness resonating with itself? Yeah, that's all it does. That's all it does. That was a good episode. Go watch it on my channel, bro. Graham. I bet you're not subscribed to my channel on the Red app. I bet only like 1 or 2 of y'all in here are subscribed to my channel on the Red app. Either one of them. Either one of my channels. Either the one that I have a stash, this TikTok account that's right there, which is connected to an account on the Red app, or this TikTok account, which is also connected to an account on the Red app. If it's resonating with itself, it's configuring itself, and then designated itself. Yeah, I mean, I would say yes, but insofar as you're not imbuing it with intentionality. Like, I don't think these are necessarily intentional acts. So I think that a thing behaves according to its nature. So it does what it does because it is what it is. And I think that it is in the nature of mind to fluctuate and dissociate. Because that's what it is. That's what minds are. That's what they do. Right? So things do according to what they are. It's a mind, so it fluctuates and dissociates. It thinks. But think in a way that is, not a person. No opposition, eh? Nobody wanna, nobody wanna, nobody wanna come up with an argument? I'm gonna restart the live, actually. I'm gonna restart it. I'll be right back.